He bought a rusty truck, and the whole town laughed at him. But what happened next, and what he revealed hidden inside, left people unable to believe their eyes. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The road that led to the scrapyard had once been asphalt, but time and heat had broken it into a cracked gray surface that looked more like dried riverbed than pavement. Weeds pushed through the fissures, thin and stubborn, their pale green stems coated with dust. Beyond the road, the industrial edge of the city stretched out in a low, uneven line of warehouses, storage tanks, and forgotten rail spurs. Somewhere in the distance, a highway hummed steadily, a constant reminder that life was still moving forward just beyond this place where things were left behind. The scrapyard itself sat like an open wound in the landscape. Mountains of twisted metal rose against the sky, stacks of cars crushed into compact cubes, their former colors reduced to rusted browns and dull reds. Bent frames, shattered windshields, and torn doors were piled without order, as if gravity alone had decided where each piece would rest. The air smelled of burned oil, old rubber, and sun-baked steel. Every few seconds, the metallic shriek of a cutting torch sliced through the quiet, followed by the heavy thud of steel collapsing onto steel. The sound echoed across the yard, hollow and final, like punctuation at the end of countless forgotten lives. This was where machines came to die, and with them, fragments of human history. A faded bumper sticker clung to a crushed trunk, still declaring loyalty to a sports team that no longer existed. A child's plastic toy was wedged beneath a pile of scrap, its bright color dulled by grime. License plates from different states lay scattered like fallen leaves, each one a silent witness to miles traveled, families moved, promises made and broken. The scrapyard did not discriminate. It swallowed everything equally. Elijah walked slowly along the narrow path between the piles, his boots crunching on gravel and shards of glass. He kept his hands in his pockets, more out of habit than warmth, and his shoulders were slightly hunched, as if he had learned over the years to take up as little space as possible. His clothes were plain and worn, chosen for durability rather than appearance. To anyone watching, he looked like another laborer passing through, another man with grease under his nails and fatigue in his eyes. He had come with a simple purpose. He needed parts, cheap ones, something he could afford. His life had narrowed into careful calculations: rent, food, fuel, tools. There was no room for mistakes, no cushion for dreams. Every dollar had to justify its existence. The scrapyard, with its abundance of discarded value, was one of the few places where someone like him could still hope to find opportunity among rejection. The workers barely glanced at him as he passed. They were used to faces like his, men who came looking for something they could not afford new. A few eyes lingered just long enough to measure him, to decide whether he was worth acknowledging. Their expressions held no outright hostility, only a tired indifference edged with quiet superiority. They belonged here. He did not. Elijah had learned long ago how to move through spaces like this without drawing attention. He kept his gaze steady, his pace unhurried, his posture neutral. Still, the weight of being unseen pressed on him. It always did. He was used to it, but that did not mean it stopped hurting. As he walked deeper into the yard, the piles grew taller and more chaotic. Entire vehicles lay on their sides, doors torn away, engines exposed like open chests. Sunlight reflected off broken chrome in sharp flashes, forcing him to squint. Sweat gathered at the back of his neck, and dust clung to his skin. The scrapyard felt endless, a maze designed to erase orientation and intention. Then he saw it. At first, it did not look different from the other hulks scattered around. It sat slightly apart, half sunken into the dirt, its massive frame tilted just enough to look wounded rather than resting. The paint was faded and blistered, once bold but now chipped and dull. Rust crept along the seams like a slow disease. The windshield was spider-webbed with cracks, one side completely shattered. Its tires were deflated, their rubber dry and cracked from years of exposure. But despite all of that, it carried a presence the others lacked. Elijah stopped walking without fully realizing he had done so. His eyes traced the long hood, the heavy grille, the squared lines that spoke of a time when machines were built to last, not to be replaced. This was not a small thing, not a commuter car or delivery van. It was a long-haul truck, a highway beast meant to cross states and seasons without complaint. Something tightened in his chest. He took a few steps closer, feeling a pull he could not explain. The closer he came, the more details revealed themselves. The grille, though pitted and bent, was intact. The frame, while rusted, did not appear warped, and there were marks that did not fit the narrative of random decay. Bolts placed too deliberately, panels that seemed thicker than necessary, welds that were far too clean for a machine that had supposedly been abandoned and abused. Elijah reached out and rested his hand against the metal. It was hot from the sun, rough beneath his palm. The contact sent a strange sensation through him, not electricity, not fear, but recognition. A memory surfaced uninvited. He was a child again, standing at the edge of a truck stop at night, the air thick with diesel fumes. Headlights cut through the darkness as massive trucks rolled in and out, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. His father stood beside him, tall and solid, one hand resting on Elijah's shoulder. He remembered the sound of the engine, deep and steady, and the way the truck seemed less like a vehicle and more like a living thing. That memory had always been blurred, softened by time and loss, but now, standing in front of this ruined machine, it sharpened painfully. Elijah stepped back, his heart pounding harder than it should have. He studied the truck from a distance, trying to regain his sense of practicality. This was ridiculous. It was just scrap. An old truck abandoned where it belonged. There was no reason for this reaction, no logic behind the pull he felt. A voice behind him broke the moment. Someone laughed, short and sharp, followed by another voice joining in. Elijah did not turn immediately. He already knew what he would see. Men leaning against equipment, arms crossed, faces shaped into expressions of amusement. He had seen that look before, directed at him in other places, other contexts. The look that said, "Someone like you has no business dreaming here." He turned anyway. Their eyes followed his gaze back to the truck, and the laughter grew louder. One of them shook his head, disbelief etched into his face. Another spat onto the ground and smirked. They did not need to say anything. The message was clear enough. Elijah felt heat rise in his face, but he did not respond. He stood there silently, his hand still tingling from the touch of metal, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. He knew what they saw, an impossible project, a financial sinkhole, a joke waiting to happen. They saw a man reaching beyond his station, and they found it entertaining. What they did not see was the way the truck mirrored his own life. Once strong, once purposeful, reduced by time and circumstance to something others dismissed without a second thought. Left to rot, not because it had nothing left to give, but because no one believed it was worth the effort. Elijah exhaled slowly and made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. He asked about the truck. The response came quickly, accompanied by more laughter. The price they named was barely more than the value of the metal itself. It was an insult disguised as generosity, a way of saying they did not expect him to take it seriously. The transaction was fast, almost careless, paperwork minimal, money exchanged without ceremony. To them, it was nothing. Another piece of junk leaving the yard. To Elijah, it felt like stepping over an invisible line. When the deal was done, he stood alone beside the truck, the laughter fading as the workers returned to their tasks. The scrapyard noises resumed their steady rhythm as if nothing had changed, but everything had. He looked at the truck again, really looked at it, and allowed himself to acknowledge the fear beneath his resolve. He had no clear plan, no guarantee of success. He knew the cost would be more than money. It would demand time, strength, patience, and faith in himself that he had rarely been allowed to exercise. Yet beneath the fear was something else, something quieter and stronger, a sense that this machine had been waiting. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the scrapyard, Elijah placed his hand on the truck once more. The metal was beginning to cool, and in that cooling he felt a strange calm. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, there was no turning back now. The place where stories ended had just given birth to a new one, even if no one else yet believed it. By the time Elijah returned to the scrapyard the next morning, the decision he had made the day before had settled into him like a weight. It was no longer a spark of impulse or defiance. It was a fact. The truck was his now, and ownership brought with it a responsibility that pressed on his chest before he even spoke to anyone. In the pale early light, the scrapyard looked different. Less theatrical, less ominous, but more honest. Rust was rust. Damage was damage. There was no hiding what he had taken on. Getting the truck out of the yard was the first lesson in humility. Elijah stood beside it with his hands on his hips, staring at the deflated tires and the way the massive frame sat stubbornly in the dirt. It was clear almost immediately that simply towing it away was not an option. The wheels resisted movement. The steering was locked, and years of neglect had fused parts together in ways that defied brute force. He walked around the truck slowly, inspecting it from every angle, measuring distances in his head, calculating costs he could not afford. The workers watched him from a distance. They did not rush to help. They waited, curious now, not because they believed he would succeed, but because they wanted to see how far he would go before reality broke him. Elijah felt their eyes on his back as he made phone calls, each one ending the same way. Too expensive, too complicated, not worth the trouble. Eventually, he found a man willing to help for a price that would hurt, but not destroy him. The arrangement was informal and fragile, based more on stubbornness than trust. When the machinery finally groaned into motion and the truck began to shift, it felt like trying to wake something that had been asleep for too long. Metal screamed in protest, chains rattled, dust billowed into the air. For a moment, the truck tilted dangerously, and Elijah's heart stopped. He imagined it collapsing in on itself, proving everyone right before it even left the yard. But then it settled, heavy and reluctant, and began to move. The journey out of the scrapyard was slow and humiliating. Heads turned as the convoy crawled past the perimeter fence. A few people laughed openly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Elijah kept his gaze forward, jaw clenched, hands curled into fists at his sides. He told himself this was part of the price. He told himself that every step forward would feel like this at first. When the truck finally arrived at the place he had prepared for it, the relief was short-lived. The space was barely adequate. A neglected corner of a rented lot, half-shaded, uneven, and unforgiving. It was the only option he had been able to secure without draining the last of his savings. As the truck was lowered into position, it became painfully clear how enormous it truly was. It dominated the space, leaving little room to work comfortably. It was a giant among scraps, demanding attention and resources he did not yet possess. Once he was alone, the real work began. Elijah climbed into the cab for the first time, carefully, as if entering a fragile structure. The door creaked loudly, its hinges stiff and complaining. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the smell of mold, old fabric, and long-dried fuel. The seats were torn, their stuffing exposed like wounds. The dashboard was cracked, instruments clouded with dust. Broken glass glittered on the floor, catching the light. He sat there for a long time without moving. From this position, the truck felt less like an object and more like a body that had been injured and abandoned. Every surface told a story of wear and strain. The steering wheel was polished smooth in places by hands that had gripped it for countless miles. The pedals were worn unevenly, evidence of habits and routes repeated over and over again. These details stirred something deep in Elijah, something that made the task ahead feel personal rather than mechanical. He forced himself to stand and begin a systematic inspection. The engine compartment was worse than he had hoped and better than he had feared. Corrosion was everywhere, but not total. Hoses had cracked, belts had degraded, and fluids had long since leaked or evaporated. Yet the core components remained intact. The block itself showed no catastrophic damage. It was a fragile kind of hope, but hope nonetheless. The electrical system was a nightmare. Wires ran in directions they should not, some spliced crudely, others bundled too neatly for factory work. It was as if different hands, with different levels of skill and intention, had interfered with the truck over time. Elijah frowned as he traced the lines with his eyes, making mental notes. This was not random neglect. Someone had altered this machine deliberately. The frame told a similar story. Rust had eaten into the surface, but the structure held. There were reinforcements in places that did not match standard designs, welded with precision rather than desperation. Elijah ran his fingers along one seam and felt the smoothness beneath the corrosion. Whoever had done this had known exactly what they were doing. As the hours passed, the scale of the project became more intimidating. Tools wore down, bolts refused to move, parts crumbled in his hands. Each small victory was followed by 2 new problems. Sweat soaked his shirt and his arms ached from effort. Still, he did not stop. That night, when exhaustion finally forced him to step back, the doubts crept in. He sat on an overturned crate and stared at the truck in the dim light. The voices he had ignored at the scrapyard returned, louder now, fueled by fatigue. This was madness. He did not have the money, the space, or the certainty to see this through. The sensible thing would be to sell it off piece by piece, recover what he could, and walk away before it ruined him. It was then that the memories of his father resurfaced more sharply than before. Elijah remembered waiting by the window as a child, watching the road for headlights that did not come. He remembered his mother's forced calm, the way conversations stopped when he entered the room. He remembered overhearing words like gone and lost and don't ask. The official story had never sat right with him. It had been too clean, too empty. Men like his father did not simply disappear without leaving something behind. He pulled the old photograph from his pocket and held it up under the light. The image was worn, creased from years of handling. His father stood beside a truck, one hand resting on the door, his posture relaxed but alert. The truck in the photo was not identical to the one before him, but the resemblance was close enough to unsettle him. The same squared lines, the same stance. Elijah looked back at the truck in front of him and felt the doubt shift into something else. The following days blurred together in a cycle of labor and survival. Elijah took on extra work wherever he could find it. Nights were short, meals were simple and sparse. Every dollar went toward tools, fluids, or replacement parts scavenged from other yards. Progress was slow, almost invisible to anyone else, but he could feel it accumulating. As he worked, he began to notice more inconsistencies. Panels that were thicker than necessary, fasteners that had been hidden rather than exposed, compartments that did not appear on any schematics he could find. He tapped along the walls of the cab with his knuckles, listening to the sound change from solid to hollow and back again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the metal in deep orange light, Elijah removed a section of interior paneling near the rear of the cab. Behind it, he found not insulation, but a carefully fitted secondary layer of steel. The edges were sealed cleanly, the welds almost invisible beneath layers of grime. He stepped back, heart pounding. This was no accident. This was not the result of amateur repairs or random reinforcement. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal something inside this truck. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cooling air. Fear followed curiosity. If the truck held something hidden, there was a reason it had been hidden so well. That reason might not be benign. Elijah weighed the risk carefully. He was already committed far beyond the point of simple retreat. Walking away now would leave him with questions that would never let him sleep again. Late that night, under a single flickering light, Elijah stood in the cab and stared at the concealed panel. His tools lay scattered around him, the floor marked with dirt and sweat and traces of effort. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Whatever this truck had been, whatever it had carried, he was going to find out. The machine that no one believed could be saved had already begun to reveal that it was never meant to be ordinary. The decision to continue no longer felt like a choice after that night. What Elijah had uncovered beneath the paneling did not yet reveal its purpose, but it changed the nature of the work entirely. The truck was no longer simply a broken machine awaiting resurrection. It was a vessel of intention. Someone had shaped it with care, foresight, and secrecy. And now, by touching it, Elijah had stepped into a story that had begun long before he arrived at the scrapyard. The days that followed were defined by labor stripped of romance. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden transformations, only work. Dirty, exhausting, relentless work. Each morning began with the same ritual. Elijah arrived early, before the sun had fully burned the haze from the air. The lot was quiet then, the metal cool beneath his hands, the world still half asleep. He used those hours to plan, to think, to decide what part of the truck would receive his limited energy that day. Disassembly came first. Bolts, frozen by years of corrosion, resisted every attempt at removal. Some snapped outright, forcing him to drill them out with trembling hands. Others refused to move at all, mocking his effort until he resorted to heat and leverage that left his arms aching and his lungs full of acrid smoke. Rust fell like red dust onto his skin, staining his clothes and settling into every crease. More than once, a tool slipped and cut him, shallow wounds that burned briefly before being ignored. He wrapped them with tape and kept going. As components came apart, he sorted them carefully, laying them out in rough order. Salvageable pieces were cleaned and set aside. Irredeemable ones were marked mentally, added to a growing list of parts he would need to find or fabricate. Each discovery forced him to recalibrate his expectations. What he had thought might take weeks stretched into months in his mind. What he had hoped to repair cheaply would demand ingenuity and sacrifice. The work was lonely in a way that went beyond physical solitude. No one stopped by to offer advice or encouragement. When people passed, they did so quickly, their interest fading as soon as they saw the scale of what he was attempting. Elijah learned to accept that isolation as a part of the process. He had lived with it long enough to understand that it could either hollow him out or harden him into something resilient. He chose the latter, though the choice had to be made again each day. Slowly, imperceptibly, he began to change alongside the truck. He learned to read the machine the way one reads a body, the way certain bolts gave under pressure while others demanded patience, the subtle differences in sound when metal was healthy versus compromised, the way grease, once cleaned away, revealed patterns of use that hinted at how the truck had lived its life. He stopped seeing the damage as chaos and began to see it as a map. The engine became his primary obsession. It was the heart of the truck, the place where success or failure would be decided. He approached it with reverence and caution, dismantling it piece by piece, documenting everything in his mind. The deeper he went, the more complex the picture became. Some components were worn exactly as expected after years of hard use. Others looked almost untouched, as if they had been replaced more recently than the rest of the truck's condition suggested. This inconsistency gnawed at him. He spent nights poring over old manuals and diagrams, comparing what he found to what should have been there. When something did not match, he did not dismiss it. He investigated. That habit slowed him down, but it also protected him from mistakes. More than once, it saved him from assembling something incorrectly based on assumptions rather than evidence. There were moments of failure that nearly broke him. One evening, after hours of careful reassembly, he attempted to test a subsystem only to watch it fail immediately. The sound it made was wrong, flat and lifeless, and Elijah felt something inside him collapse with it. He shut everything down and sat on the ground, his back against the tire, staring at nothing. In those moments, the voices returned. The laughter from the scrapyard, the warnings from people who believed they were being kind. The internal echo of every time he had been told, directly or indirectly, that his ambitions exceeded his worth. The temptation to quit pressed on him like a physical force. But then there were the small victories. A seized component that finally turned free. A replacement part found for a fraction of its expected cost. A subsystem that responded exactly as it should, confirming that his understanding was growing. These moments did not announce themselves loudly. They came quietly, almost shyly, but they accumulated. Each one reinforced the sense that he was not fighting blindly. He was learning. He was becoming capable. The cab restoration brought him face to face with the truck's past in a more intimate way. As he stripped away layers of interior, he uncovered traces of the people who had spent their lives inside this confined space. Scuff marks where boots had rubbed the same spot over and over. Discoloration on the dashboard from a hand resting there during long drives. Tiny scratches near the door handle that spoke of habits formed unconsciously. He cleaned carefully, preserving what he could without erasing the evidence of use. This was not about making the truck look new, it was about making it whole. The hidden reinforcements he had discovered earlier became more apparent as he worked. Panels that should have been decorative were structural. Insulation had been replaced with denser material that offered not comfort, but concealment. When he tapped certain sections of the cab walls, the sound was unmistakably hollow, but not empty. It was controlled, deliberate. Elijah began to understand that the truck had been designed to carry more than freight. This realization brought fear with it. Late at night, when the lot was empty and the only sound was the distant rush of traffic, he found himself glancing over his shoulder more often. The thought that someone might still care about what this truck contained crept into his mind. He reminded himself that years had passed, that the truck had been discarded without ceremony. Still, the sense of unease lingered. He chose to keep working anyway. One night, driven by equal parts exhaustion and determination, Elijah focused on the rear section of the cab where the concealed steel layer lay hidden. He did not open it yet. Instead, he examined its edges, traced the welds with his fingers, and studied how it had been integrated into the surrounding structure. It was masterfully done. Not rushed, not sloppy. Whoever had installed it expected it to last. That realization shifted something inside him. This was not a hiding place created in panic. It was preparation. The work began to feel less like restoration and more like excavation. Elijah was not simply fixing what was broken. He was uncovering intent. Each decision he made carried weight now, not just for the future of the truck, but for the truth embedded within it. Physically, the strain was immense. His hands were perpetually sore, his back stiff, his sleep shallow. There were mornings when standing up felt like a battle he might lose. Yet even in those moments, he noticed a change in himself. His movements were more confident. His decisions came faster. He trusted his judgment in ways he never had before. He was rebuilding more than metal. The turning point came late one evening when he removed a section of the cab wall he had been avoiding. Behind it was not insulation or wiring, but a smooth expanse of steel that did not belong. When he struck it lightly with a tool, the sound was unmistakable. Hollow. Elijah stood very still, the tool hanging loosely in his hand. His heart beat loudly in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of the night. Every instinct told him that this was the threshold he had been circling since the scrapyard. Crossing it would change everything. He cleaned the area carefully, wiping away grime until faint markings became visible. They were subtle, almost invisible unless you knew to look for them. Small, etched lines, reference points, instructions left behind without words. Someone had intended for this space to be found, but only by the right hands. Elijah stepped back and looked at the truck as a whole. For the first time, he did not see a project on the verge of collapse. He saw a machine that had survived because it was meant to. A machine that had been waiting for someone patient enough, desperate enough to listen. He shut off the lights and locked up for the night, knowing sleep would not come easily. Tomorrow he would cut into the steel. Tomorrow he would cross the line between repair and revelation. The struggle that had begun as a test of endurance was about to become something far more dangerous and far more meaningful. The night after Elijah traced the faint markings along the hidden panel, sleep came in fragments. His mind replayed the sensation of hollow metal again and again, the way the sound had lingered just a fraction too long, as if answering him. When dawn finally arrived, it did not bring relief. It brought clarity. The decision had already been made. There would be no peace for him until the truth inside the truck was exposed, whatever that truth might be. He arrived earlier than usual, the sky still pale and undecided, the air cool enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. The truck loomed in the half-light, its massive shape familiar now, almost companionable. Elijah paused beside it for a moment, placing his hand against the steel as he had on the day he bought it. The metal was cold, unresponsive, yet the contact steadied him. He was no longer working on an object. He was continuing a conversation begun long before he understood its language. He began by preparing carefully, methodically. He cleared the floor of loose tools and debris, arranging what he would need within easy reach. He checked measurements twice, tracing the etched lines he had cleaned the night before, confirming that they were intentional, not the product of chance. The markings formed a subtle geometry, a map hidden in plain sight. Whoever had placed them there had trusted that the right person would recognize their purpose. Elijah's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the cutting tool. He forced himself to pause, breathing slowly until the shaking subsided. This was not the moment for haste. One wrong cut could destroy whatever lay behind the panel, erasing answers that had survived decades only to be lost to impatience. The first contact of blade against steel sent a shower of sparks across the cab. The sound was sharp and violent, echoing off the interior walls. Elijah flinched instinctively, and then steadied himself and continued. He worked slowly, following the lines he had identified, letting the tool do its work without forcing it. The smell of heated metal filled the air, acrid and unmistakable, mixing with the lingering scents of oil and dust. As the cut deepened, his awareness narrowed. The outside world ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the blade, the vibration in his hands, the steady progression of the cut. Time stretched, lost its meaning. He was dimly aware of sweat running down his back, of his muscles straining to maintain control, but none of it mattered. When the final segment gave way, the panel did not fall. It loosened, shifting almost imperceptibly, as if reluctant to reveal what it had guarded for so long. Elijah set the tool aside and pried gently at the edges, careful not to bend the metal more than necessary. With a soft groan, the panel came free. Behind it was not empty space, but a perfectly fitted compartment, its interior lined with a dark, protective material. It looked less like a crude hiding place and more like a vault designed for movement. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. This was no afterthought. This had been planned. He reached inside slowly, half expecting some unseen mechanism to resist him. Nothing happened. His fingers brushed against smooth surfaces, then encountered the edge of a container secured within the compartment. He shifted his grip and pulled. The container was heavier than he anticipated. He set it down carefully on the cab floor, staring at it in silence. It was rectangular, sealed, its exterior marked only by age and careful construction. For a long moment, he did not open it. He sat back against the driver's seat and let the weight of what he had done settle over him. When he finally broke the seal, the contents did not glitter. There was no dramatic burst of wealth, no immediate confirmation of triumph. Instead, there was paper, neatly arranged and preserved, folders bound with string, maps folded with precision, envelopes labeled in a small, disciplined hand. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, lay bundles of old currency, their edges worn, their presence functional rather than boastful. Elijah lifted one of the folders and opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, sparse and direct, filled with dates, locations, symbols that repeated across pages. At first, they meant nothing to him, but as he continued, patterns emerged, routes traced across states, Stops marked at seemingly unremarkable locations, symbols denoting safety, danger, completion. This was not a record of commerce. It was a record of movement. His pulse quickened as he realized what he was holding. These were not the remnants of a single journey, but of many. Carefully planned, carefully executed. Lives moved quietly through the spaces between attention and neglect. The truck had been part of something larger, something invisible by design. As he sifted through the documents, his hand froze. A name stared back at him from the page. At first, Elijah assumed it was coincidence. The world was full of shared names, shared initials. He turned the page, then another. The name appeared again, paired with dates and notations that made his chest tighten. It was written in the same disciplined hand, repeated with consistency, purpose. His father's name. The air seemed to leave the cab all at once. Elijah felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the floor had shifted beneath him. He closed his eyes, pressing his fingers against his temples, trying to steady his thoughts. Memories flooded in unbidden. His father's quiet intensity. The way he spoke little about his work. The long absences explained away with vague assurances. The sudden, final disappearance that had never been fully explained. Elijah reopened his eyes and stared at the page. The handwriting did not match his father's, but the presence of the name was undeniable. It was not a casual mention. It was integrated into the system of notes, recurring with the kind of regularity that suggested trust and responsibility. He dug deeper into the container, his movements growing more urgent despite his effort to remain careful. He found identification documents bearing different names, but similar photographs. He found keys labeled only with symbols that matched those on the maps. He found letters written in coded language, their meaning obscured but their tone unmistakably serious. Each discovery tightened the knot in his chest. The story he had been told all his life began to unravel, replaced by something far more complex and far more painful. His father had not simply vanished. He had been part of a network that existed beyond the reach of official records, a network that had required secrecy not for profit, but for survival. Fear crept in alongside revelation. Elijah became acutely aware of his surroundings, of the thin walls separating him from the outside world. If this network had been exposed once, what guarantee was there that it had not left enemies behind? The thought that someone might still be searching for remnants of this operation made his skin prickle. He considered stopping, sealing the compartment again, pretending he had never found it. The temptation was strong. Ignorance had a certain safety to it, but the name on the page anchored him. This was no longer an abstract mystery. This was his history. As the light shifted outside the cab, Elijah continued reading. He began to understand the structure of what he was seeing. The notes detailed a system of transport designed to move people quietly through hostile territory. The routes avoided major checkpoints, relied on human relationships rather than infrastructure. The truck was not just transportation, it was shelter, disguise, and lifeline. One document stood out from the rest. It was shorter, more fragmented, the handwriting less steady. The final lines were incomplete, cut off mid-thought. The date corresponded roughly with the time his father had disappeared. The location was marked with a symbol he had not seen elsewhere, followed by a single word that felt heavy with implication. Last. Elijah closed the folder and sat back, his hands resting on his knees. The cab felt smaller now, charged with meaning and memory. He imagined his father sitting where he sat, writing these notes, knowing the risks, choosing to take them anyway. The anger Elijah had carried for years softened into something more complicated. Respect, sorrow, and a deep, aching pride tangled together inside him. He did not leave the lot that day. He stayed until darkness fell, organizing the contents of the container, memorizing what he could, securing everything once more within the compartment. He resealed the panel temporarily, not erasing the opening, but protecting it, aware now that the truck held not just mechanical secrets, but moral ones. As he locked up and stepped away, Elijah felt a profound shift within himself. The project had ceased to be about restoration alone. It was about stewardship, about carrying forward a truth that had been hidden because it had needed to be. The truck had not survived by accident. It had endured because it was meant to be found. And now that it had been, Elijah understood that he could not simply put the steel back together and walk away. The compartment within the steel had opened a door that could not be closed, leading him toward answers that would demand courage equal to the patience that had brought him this far. After the compartment had been opened and resealed, the truck no longer felt silent. Even when Elijah stood outside it, tools idle in his hands, he sensed a presence that had not been there before. It was not fear alone, though fear was part of it. It was awareness. The truck had crossed an invisible boundary, moving from object to witness, and Elijah could not unknow what it carried. The days following the discovery passed in a strange suspension. Elijah continued working on the restoration, but the rhythm had changed. Every movement now felt deliberate, weighed against what he had learned. He was careful not to attract attention, mindful of how often he came and went, cautious about who saw him working late into the night. The secrecy that had once belonged to the truck had begun to shape his own behavior. At night, when the lot was quiet and the world narrowed to the glow of a single lamp, Elijah returned to the contents of the hidden compartment. He studied the document slowly, patiently, teaching himself how to read what was never meant to be read quickly. The notes were sparse, written with an economy of language that left no room for sentiment. Names were abbreviated or replaced with symbols. Locations were coded through indirect references rather than coordinates. Yet patterns emerged for anyone willing to look long enough. Elijah traced the routes with his finger across the maps, following the lines as they threaded through back roads, industrial zones, forgotten towns, and stretches of open land that barely registered on official charts. These were paths designed to avoid scrutiny, to slip between systems rather than confront them. The truck had been a moving blind spot, too ordinary to attract suspicion, too constant to be questioned. As his understanding deepened, Elijah began to search beyond the papers themselves. He spent hours in libraries and archives, combing through old newspapers, municipal records, and forgotten databases. He searched for fragments that might align with what he had found, reports of families who vanished without explanation, mentions of abandoned safe houses uncovered years too late, vague references to rumors that had never been substantiated. Slowly, painfully, the past began to take shape. The network described in the documents was not large, but it was resilient. It relied on people who lived on the margins, those accustomed to moving without notice. Truck drivers, mechanics, small business owners along highways who asked few questions and remembered fewer names. They formed a chain of trust that stretched across states, invisible to those who did not know where to look. The people they helped were not criminals. They were families fleeing violence, intimidation, and systematic injustice. People who had exhausted official avenues and found them closed or hostile. The truck had offered passage when no other path remained, carrying its human cargo concealed behind steel and silence. Elijah began to understand why secrecy had been absolute. Exposure would not have meant embarrassment or financial loss. It would have meant lives destroyed. Within this growing understanding, his father's role became clearer. The recurring references to his name were not incidental. They marked responsibility, coordination, decision-making. His father had not been a peripheral participant. He had been central, trusted with routes and timing, and trusted with the safety of those inside the truck. This realization shifted Elijah's memories in unsettling ways. Moments from his childhood took on new meaning. The way his father would study maps late at night. The phone calls he took outside, his voice low and controlled. The tension Elijah had sensed without understanding. What he had once perceived as distance now revealed itself as vigilance. The final entry in the documents haunted him most. It was incomplete, written under what Elijah imagined must have been immense pressure. The handwriting wavered, the spacing uneven. It referenced a rendezvous point marked only by a symbol and a time window that suggested urgency. The word last appeared not as a declaration, but as a quiet acknowledgement. This was the end of something. Whether by design or necessity, Elijah could not tell. He began to ask himself questions he had avoided for years. What had truly happened to his father on that final journey? Whether he had been betrayed by someone within the network or discovered by those who opposed it. Whether his disappearance had been an act of sacrifice rather than failure. These questions led Elijah beyond documents and into the physical world. Using the coordinates and symbols he had decoded, he visited several of the locations marked on the maps. Some were unremarkable, barely worth a glance. A closed diner beside a highway exit. An abandoned warehouse reclaimed by weeds. A strip of land where nothing stood anymore except a few concrete foundations. Yet, standing in those places, Elijah felt the echo of movement, of people passing through briefly and leaving no trace. At one location, he found a rusted signpost bearing a faint symbol that matched those in the documents. It was nearly erased by time, visible only when the light struck it at the right angle. Elijah stood there for a long time, imagining the truck pulling in under cover of darkness, doors opening briefly, lives stepping out into uncertainty and hope. The emotional toll of these discoveries was heavier than any physical labor. Elijah found himself grieving not only his father, but the years of misunderstanding that had followed his disappearance. Anger he had carried dissolved into something more complex. His father had not chosen absence lightly. He had chosen responsibility over safety, duty over visibility. Yet that understanding did not bring closure. It demanded action. As Elijah continued his research, he began to notice subtle reactions from the world around him. A librarian lingered too long over his requests. An older man at a roadside stop studied him with an expression that bordered on recognition before turning away. Once, while photographing an abandoned building tied to the roots, Elijah felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. These moments sharpened his caution. He limited how much he shared, even with those who seemed sympathetic. The secrecy of the past seeped into the present, reminding him that some truths, once uncovered, carried their own risks. Meanwhile, the truck itself continued to reveal its purpose. As Elijah restored its systems, he uncovered more evidence of its former life. Ventilation channels hidden within the walls, reinforced floor panels designed to distribute weight evenly, subtle modifications that would have made extended occupancy possible without detection. Every detail spoke of foresight and care. The truck had been designed not just to move people, but to protect them. Elijah came to understand that the scrapyard had not been the end of the truck's story, but an attempt to erase it. The machine had been stripped of identifying features, its purpose obscured, its existence reduced to scrap. It had survived not because anyone intended it to, but because no one believed it mattered anymore. That belief had been a mistake. The deeper Elijah went, the clearer his path became. He could not simply restore the truck and hide what he had found. To do so would repeat the cycle of silence that had consumed his father's life. The truth demanded to be carried forward, not buried again. One evening, as he organized his notes and secured the documents once more within the compartment, Elijah felt a shift inside himself. The project was no longer a gamble or a personal challenge. It was a responsibility inherited rather than chosen. He was not merely fixing a machine. He was becoming a steward of a story that history had tried to discard. The past, once fragmented and uncertain, had begun to coalesce into a narrative too significant to ignore. And with that realization came the knowledge that restoring the truck was only the first step. When it returned to the road, it would carry more than steel and fuel. It would carry memory, truth, and the weight of choices made in silence. As Elijah closed the compartment and stood back, the truck loomed before him no longer just a monument to endurance, but a vessel of legacy. The hidden history had found its way into his hands, and it was clear now that it would not let go without reshaping his future. The road ahead promised no simplicity, but for the first time Elijah understood where it led. By the time Elijah reached the final stage of the restoration, the truck no longer resembled the forgotten wreck he had dragged out of the scrapyard. Yet it also did not look like something freshly born. Its surface carried a deliberate balance between renewal and memory, as if the years it had endured were not a flaw to be erased, but a truth to be acknowledged. The mechanical work became more precise, almost ceremonial. Every system was tested and retested, not out of fear of failure alone, but out of respect for what the truck had once carried and might carry again. Elijah moved through the process with a calm he had not possessed at the beginning. Where he had once second-guessed himself constantly, he now trusted his hands and his judgment. The engine, once silent and corroded, had been reassembled piece by piece, cleaned, aligned, and tuned with patience bordering on reverence. When he tightened the final bolts, he paused longer than necessary, his palm resting against the metal as if feeling for a pulse. The exterior took shape slowly. Elijah resisted the temptation to erase every scar. He removed corrosion where it threatened the integrity of the frame, reinforced weakened sections, and sealed exposed seams, but he left certain marks untouched. Small dents remained. Faint discolorations told stories he did not want to silence. When the fresh paint finally went on, it was applied carefully, evenly, restoring the truck's presence without turning it into something false. In the sunlight, it looked powerful again, not pristine but honest. Inside the cab, the transformation was quieter. The torn upholstery was repaired, not replaced outright. The dashboard was restored to function, its instruments cleaned and recalibrated. Elijah ensured that everything worked as it should, but he preserved the subtle signs of use. The steering wheel still bore the smoothness of countless miles. The floor panels, now reinforced and secure, still carried faint traces of wear. This was not a museum piece. It was a living machine. Throughout this process, Elijah remained aware of the hidden compartment. He did not open it again unnecessarily. Its contents were secure, protected, waiting. Knowing it was there changed how he worked. Every decision carried an added layer of responsibility. He was not restoring a relic. He was preparing a vessel. The day came when there was nothing left to fix. Elijah stood beside the truck in the early morning light, tools packed away, hands idle for the first time in months. The lot was quiet, the air cool and still. This was the moment he had imagined and feared in equal measure. There would be no more preparation, no more excuses. What remained was action. He climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. The sound was solid, reassuring. He sat there for a long time without touching anything, breathing in the familiar scent of metal and oil, aware of how far he had come from the man who had first stepped into the scrapyard. His hand hovered over the ignition. For an instant, doubt flickered. If the engine failed, if something he had overlooked revealed itself now, the weight of it would be crushing. He pushed the thought aside and turned the key. At first, there was only the sound of systems engaging, the low electrical hum that preceded life. Then the engine coughed, faltered, and went silent. Elijah's jaw tightened. He waited, counted his breaths, and tried again. This time the response was different. The engine caught, hesitated, then roared into motion with a depth that filled the cab and vibrated through his chest. The sound was rich and steady, unmistakably alive. Elijah closed his eyes as the vibration settled into a rhythm, a familiar cadence that seemed to echo memories he had never fully lived himself. When he opened them, his vision blurred briefly. He did not wipe his face. He let the engine run, listening, feeling for irregularities. There were none. The truck idled as if it had never been silent, as if it had merely been waiting for permission to speak again. When he finally eased the truck forward, the sensation was surreal. The weight shifted smoothly. The steering responded with confidence. As the truck rolled out of the lot and onto the road, Elijah felt something release inside him. Months of strain and vigilance loosened, replaced by a quiet certainty. He did not drive far at first. He circled familiar streets, tested brakes and acceleration, listened for any hint of trouble. The truck responded flawlessly. It drew attention immediately. People stopped and stared, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. Some recognized the shape, the size, the authority of the machine, but none could have guessed its origin. Eventually, Elijah turned toward the scrapyard. The return was not planned for confrontation, but it became one nonetheless. As he approached the familiar entrance, workers looked up in confusion. The truck they saw was not the wreck they remembered. It moved with confidence, paint catching the light, engine humming with controlled power. Conversations stopped. Laughter died unfinished. Elijah slowed as he passed the place where the truck had once sat abandoned. He did not look at anyone directly. He did not need to. The silence spoke loudly enough. He did not linger. The point had been made without words. In the days that followed, the truck's presence began to ripple outward. People asked questions. Some recognized the craftsmanship. Others sensed that there was a story behind it, something more than mechanical success. Elijah answered carefully, sharing what could be verified, what could be proven, without exposing what still needed protection. He brought the documents to those who could authenticate them. Archivists confirmed the age and origin of the materials. Historians noted the consistency of routes with undocumented migration patterns and whispered networks long suspected but never proven. Journalists approached him with curiosity tempered by disbelief. With attention came pressure. There were offers, some subtle, others blunt, money for the truck, money for the documents, promises of anonymity, of comfort, of an easier life. Elijah listened without committing. He understood the temptation. After years of scarcity, the idea of financial relief carried undeniable appeal. But each offer felt wrong. He began to sense resistance as well. Not everyone welcomed the resurfacing of this history. Some questions were met with silence. Some inquiries were redirected or delayed. Once, Elijah found his workspace disturbed. Nothing missing, but clearly searched. The message was unspoken but clear. Fear returned, sharper this time, grounded in reality rather than imagination. Elijah adjusted his routines, varied his schedules, ensured the truck was never left unattended for long. He was careful with his words, his movements, his trust. Still, he did not stop. The first long drive came on a clear morning when the horizon stretched wide and inviting. Elijah guided the truck onto the highway, merging smoothly with the flow of traffic. The engine settled into a steady cadence, the road unfolding beneath the wheels. This was where the truck belonged. The highway felt like a continuation rather than a destination. As miles passed, Elijah felt a sense of alignment he had never known. He imagined his father on similar roads, hands on the same kind of wheel, eyes scanning the distance with quiet focus. The anger that had once defined his memory softened further, replaced by understanding and a sense of connection that transcended time. When he stopped at a rest area along a route marked in the old maps, Elijah stepped out and stood beside the truck. The landscape was ordinary, easily overlooked, yet knowing what had once occurred here transformed it. He was standing in a place where lives had changed direction, where fear had met courage in silence. As the sun dipped lower, Elijah returned to the cab and continued on. The road stretched ahead, darkening gradually, illuminated by the steady sweep of headlights. The truck moved forward without hesitation, carrying its history openly now, no longer hidden beneath rust and neglect. The return to the road was more than a test of mechanics. It was a declaration. The past had not been erased. It had endured, waiting for the moment it could move again. Elijah drove on, aware that what he carried would demand more of him than he had ever given before. But for the first time, the demand did not feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. The machine that had once been dismissed as unsalvageable was alive again, and with it, a story that refused to remain buried. The attention did not fade after the truck returned to the road. If anything, it intensified, gathering weight and momentum as word spread beyond the circles Elijah could see. The machine that had once been laughed at in a scrapyard now carried a presence that drew people in without effort. It was not only the craftsmanship that stirred curiosity, nor even the mystery hinted at by its careful restoration. It was the feeling that the truck represented something unfinished, something that had waited too long to be acknowledged. Elijah felt that weight every time he climbed into the cab. The offers began arriving with increasing boldness. At first, they came wrapped in politeness, framed as admiration from collectors and investors who spoke of rarity, of historical value, of profit potential. They praised his work, his perseverance, his vision. They spoke of numbers large enough to solve problems he had carried for most of his adult life. Debts erased, stability secured, a future no longer balanced on careful calculations and exhaustion. Each offer carried the same unspoken suggestion. Sell. Let the story become an object again, let it pass into private hands where it could be controlled, curated, and ultimately quieted. Elijah listened without committing, the words washing over him like static. He understood the temptation more clearly than anyone offering it could imagine. He knew what it meant to live without margin, to measure survival in weeks rather than years. The idea of release was seductive in its simplicity. But every time he imagined accepting, the image collapsed under its own weight. He would see his father's name on the page again, written with care and intention. He would remember the routes traced across maps, the lives that had passed through the hidden space behind the steel. He would feel the hum of the engine beneath his hands and understand that the truck was no longer his to trade away. It had never truly been his in that sense. He had found it, yes, restored it. But ownership was not the same as stewardship. The pressure did not come only in the form of money. Some inquiries carried a sharper edge, questions that felt rehearsed, requests for access to documents framed as academic interest but delivered with urgency. There were moments when Elijah sensed resistance rather than curiosity, as if certain truths were expected to remain buried no matter how much time had passed. Once, a message arrived without a return address, advising him to be careful about what he shared and with whom. It did not threaten. It did not need to. Fear returned, but it did not rule him. Elijah responded by choosing visibility over silence. He began to plan deliberately, moving away from isolation and secrecy without abandoning caution. He partnered with historians and legal advocates who understood the significance of what had been uncovered. He shared documentation carefully, ensuring that copies existed beyond his control, that the truth could not be erased by removing a single person or object. Each step felt like crossing another threshold, trading personal safety for collective memory. The truck became the center of this effort. Elijah transformed it not into a spectacle, but into a presence. He restored certain interior sections to show how the concealed spaces had functioned, leaving others untouched, hidden behind panels that remained sealed. Visitors were not invited to marvel at clever engineering alone. They were invited to understand why such engineering had been necessary at all. The truck traveled to small towns and forgotten cities, stopping in places that mirrored those marked on the old maps. Sometimes people recognized the routes instinctively, even if they could not articulate why. Others came simply because they had heard there was something worth seeing, something that did not fit neatly into official narratives. Stories began to surface. An older woman spoke quietly of a night decades earlier when her family had been moved without explanation, told only to trust the driver and remain silent. A man recalled a rumor from his childhood about a truck that never appeared on manifests but always arrived when needed. These accounts did not always align perfectly, but together they formed a mosaic of lived experience that filled in the spaces between the documents. Elijah listened more than he spoke. With each story, the weight he carried shifted. What had once felt like a private inheritance expanded into a shared responsibility. He realized that the truck was not merely a memorial to his father's choices, but to a network of courage that had never sought recognition. These were people who had acted without expectation of reward, believing only that survival itself was justification enough. The funds he had found in the compartment became the foundation of something new. Elijah refused to treat the money as personal gain. Instead, he worked with advisors to establish a foundation dedicated to legal aid, relocation assistance, and education for families facing systemic barriers. The truck's story gave the effort credibility, grounding it in history rather than abstraction. What had once been done quietly out of necessity could now be supported openly, without disguise. The work was exhausting, often overwhelming. There were setbacks, bureaucratic obstacles, and moments when the magnitude of the task threatened to swallow him whole. But there was also a clarity he had never known before. Each challenge felt connected to a purpose larger than comfort or recognition. In quieter moments, Elijah reflected on his own transformation. He was no longer the man who had walked into a scrapyard looking for cheap parts and left with a wreck everyone mocked. He no longer measured his worth by how invisible he could remain. Through the process of restoration, he had reclaimed not only a machine, but his understanding of himself. He had inherited more than unanswered questions. He had inherited a standard. The anger he had once carried toward his father dissolved completely. In its place stood a nuanced understanding of fear, courage, and sacrifice. His father had not been perfect. He had made choices that left wounds behind, but those choices had also saved lives. Elijah learned to hold both truths without letting either erase the other. The truck remained central to this reckoning. At night, when the events of the day receded and the world grew quiet, Elijah would sometimes drive alone along stretches of road that mirrored those from the old maps. The headlights carved tunnels through darkness, the engine's steady rhythm grounding him in the present. In those moments, he felt close to his father, not as a memory frozen in loss, but as a presence carried forward through action. The public response evolved over time. Initial fascination gave way to respect, then to something deeper. The truck became a symbol not of spectacle, but of persistence. It stood as proof that what society dismisses as worthless can hold immense meaning if someone is willing to look closely enough. Young people lingered longest at the exhibits, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Why had this been necessary? Who decides whose safety matters? What is owed to those who act in silence? Elijah never offered simple answers. The laughter from the scrapyard felt distant now, almost unreal. Those who had once mocked him avoided his gaze when their paths crossed, not out of shame alone, but out of recognition. They had misjudged not just a machine, but a man's resolve. That misjudgment could not be undone, only remembered. As years passed, the truck's story became woven into the fabric of the communities it touched. It was no longer a curiosity. It was a reference point, a reminder that history does not always announce itself, and that courage often wears ordinary faces. On a clear evening, Elijah found himself alone again on the highway, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The truck moved with confidence, its engine a steady companion. The world beyond the windshield flowed past in quiet continuity. He thought of the scrapyard where the story had begun, of the place where endings were assumed and value was measured in weight and scrap. He understood now how wrong that assumption had been. The truck had not been trash. Neither had his father's silence. Neither had the lives moved quietly through the dark. What had been discarded was not meaning, but patience. As the road unfolded beneath the wheels, Elijah felt no need to hurry. The destination mattered less than the motion itself. The legacy he carried was not something to be sold or displayed behind glass. It was something to be lived mile after mile, choice after choice. The truck continued forward, its headlights cutting through the night, carrying with it a history that could no longer be erased and a future shaped not by wealth, but by purpose. If this story surprised you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Watch our next videos to discover more hidden stories that shocked everyone. And if this story moved you, share this video with someone who needs to see it.